Hey, DawgNation, I'm Brandon Adams, and this is DawgNation Daily, the daily podcast for Georgia Bulldogs fans. It's good to have you with us. It's John Stinchcomb later on, more of our On the East season preview series. A lot on wide receivers today on the show. I'm going to talk about why I think that the reputation of this wide receiver core this season, it may not change. It may not be a strength again, as John and I'll get into. There's still some unanswered questions for this group this year, but of all the position groups in the Georgia roster, this could be the one who could really see its reputation enhanced by a big season this year. We'll talk about why next. Good to have you with us. DawgNation Daily, daily podcast for Georgia Bulldogs fans, and it begins right now.
Presented by DawgNation.com, this is DawgNation Daily, the daily podcast for Georgia Bulldogs fans. Here's your host, Brandon Adams.
So I hope that, we're very clear about doing this. The shows that we're doing this week are not live the way we typically record. The podcast people, you never listen to something live. It's always recorded. But for the video people, some of you anyway, do watch it live. Most people even watch the video after the fact, but it's normally kind of a day of type thing for us. We've been on vacation this week. So as a way of kind of doing something during the week that we don't have to, worry about not seeming relevant or anything like that, because let's face it, while we're gone, there's a chance that some news will break and we won't be able to talk about it until we get back on Monday. So the safest thing to do during a vacation week type of thing is to do a Own the East season preview type deal. I'm very proud of the fact that we've been doing this now. This is our fourth year of doing that. First time we've done it as a part of DawgNation Daily. It's typically a series that begins kind of outside of DawgNation Daily. It may work its way in before things are said and done. But this year, Own the East is actually starting right here with us on DawgNation Daily. So I'm really excited about that. And, of course, anything that happens while we're gone on vacation this week, we'll obviously deal with when we get back. But I think that there's a lot to be said and done when it comes to the season preview stuff for Georgia. It's John Stinchcomb later on. The topic at hand today is going to be wide receivers. And I think it goes without saying this group has a chance to play better this year than it did a year ago. You remember, what a challenge it was last season. I don't think that was encapsulated any better, or I guess maybe better said, any worse than during the South Carolina game where the Georgia offense just couldn't do anything. Gamecocks defensive backs all over the place. One guy alone comes, I think, with 3 picks that day. Just a disastrous day. And when it comes to the frustrations of the wide receiver core and how they contributed to that unfortunate loss for Georgia, Kirby Smart didn't mince words back then as a way of setting up how things might be different in 2020. Let me let you hear Kirby Smart talking about the problems of a year ago.
Yeah, they did a great job. If you had to say one thing that they did well, they got their hands on our guys, and there was not a lot of vertical separation, and there's a couple of those that was frustrating. They played man-to-man. They pressed George, they pressed Tyler, they pressed Lawrence, they pressed Cager, and they got 2 good corners that are really long. We knew that all week. So, the idea was to try to get them on the move. To get people off of you, you have to get in bunches and do some different things. And we did a lot of those things to get them off of us. But they did a nice job. A couple of those picks were because they were just all over us.
So press coverage was the kind of thing that Georgia a year ago had a hard time getting off of. And this year, you think things have a way of being potentially way different. First of all, George Pickens is a much better player now, it would stand to reason, than he was at the time of that South Carolina game. Really, after that South Carolina game, Pickens continued to really thrive and really came into his own as a player in the aftermath of that game. Most outstanding players, part of the Sugar Bowl, for instance, kind of gives you an idea of the way in which Pickens grew over the course of that year, the way in which South Carolina was able to dominate at the line of scrimmage physically with its defensive backs. Hard to imagine you doing that against Pickens as much right now, to say nothing of other Georgia players who have a chance to just kind of perform better in that regard. It's not a given that's going to happen, but it's easy to imagine the receivers, I would say, even got better after the South Carolina game. How much more growth could you have, over the course of an off season there in that regard? But this goes beyond just players getting a year older and getting a year better. I thought that Connor Raleigh had a good piece at DawgNation.com the other day looking at something that Matt Zenitz, who we typically think of as the master of the transfer portal. He seems to always know who's in the transfer portal, but he also wrote some interesting stuff for AL.com about some coaches potentially on the rise, future stars in the coaching ranks. And by the way, we talked about this on DawgNation Daily a couple of months ago, so we were ahead of the curve on this as a topic, but Zenitz echoing something we've already said, that a future star in the coaching ranks could be Georgia's wide receivers coach, Cortez Hankton. In fact, here's what Zenitz said about Hankton, that a high-ranking NFL staff member was extremely complimentary of Hankton and said that he wouldn't be surprised to see Hankton land an offensive coordinator job in the near future. You can read more from Connor Riley on that at DawgNation.com with the full quotes on Hankton and kind of more context on what Hankton brings to the table. And I absolutely think this has a chance to be true. Would not surprise me if it did. One of the things that is instrumental for me on this, and we're going to talk more about the 2020 arrivals for Georgia and the incoming freshmen from the most recent recruiting class. We're going to talk more about them in a moment. But one of the things that always jumped out to me when those receivers were talking about reasons why they were choosing Georgia, the name Cortez Hankton, as you expect for a position group, but Hankton is a guy that maybe some Georgia fans know less than other position coach guys like, say, Del McGee, what he currently is, what Sam Pittman used to be. Hankton's maybe a little less well-known amongst Georgia fans than some other position groups in this Georgia roster. I've told you this before. I think that in terms of the recruiting success that he's had, in terms of how he impacted George Pickens, we've had people come on the show before and say that Hankton in particular, in maintaining a relationship with Pickens as long as he did, is one of the things that opened the door for Pickens to flip from Auburn to Georgia when he made that decision as a part of the 2019 class, and also the work that he did to get guys to join the 2020 class. That's the kind of coach that Georgia has felt very comfortable putting at the forefront of its recruiting efforts. And it's easy to wonder, well, what's going on with the Georgia wide receiver receiving corps when, let's face it, until recently, this was a position group that Georgia has not really recruited at the elite level, with all due respect. The way in which 5-star guys and very highly rated 4-star guys have been stacked in recent classes, that's not what previous editions of the Georgia, wide receiver room have looked like. In fact, you have to go back a good number of years to find guys who had as productive of a season as Pickens had a year ago, and it's no surprise that he's as higher rated recruit as Georgia's had the receiver spot. Also going back years and years and years. This was a group for a number of years. A lot of this predates Kirby Smart, by the way. This was just a receiving corps that did not get the same level of, or did not enjoy the same level of recruiting success that a lot of the other position groups did. A lot of it has a way of changing in 2020. Georgia has kind of recruited receivers on the basis of early playing time to be had, come here and we need you bad, we'll use you quickly. Well, gosh, that's one thing to sell when you need to, but what's better to be able to sell is come here and look at the way you're going to thrive in a Todd Monken offense. That has a chance to happen this year. And Cortez Hankton's relationship or reputation growing as a big-time coaching prospect because of the work that he does with these receivers, I think that has a chance to change too. We all remember the horrible circumstances of losing a game against South Carolina in which the receivers just couldn't get open. Other games in which there was some frustration. And listen, that's not all going to be blamed on the receivers. I think that James Coley's offensive scheme last season didn't really work. And Jake Fromm, the quarterback, had his problems at times also there as well. I'm not going to scapegoat the receivers for the entirety of what happened in 2019, but we would all acknowledge, even if we won't say that, the receiving play could have been better a year ago. Well, 2020 is the year that might happen. And as it does, Cortez Hankton's reputation will be enhanced because of it. And in the future, all of a sudden, recruits may view Georgia the same way they look at linebackers in this program, or running backs in this program, or offensive linemen in this program. The kind of place you go to because it'll get you to the NFL. The kind of place you go to because you will be highlighted and showcased in this offense. It could be one of the fun parts about 2020. It's not a guarantee that the Georgia wide receiving group is going to be one of this team's strength. There's still some unanswered questions. John Stinchcomb will talk more about that in a moment. But there's a lot to like, and there's some room for improvement, and I can't wait to see if that indeed does take place. My name is Brandon Adams, and this is DawgNation Daily, the daily podcast for Georgia Bulldogs fans. Available to you in a number of platforms, even on a week like this when we're pre-recorded on Facebook and YouTube. On the radio, typically on Athens Sports Radio 960 The Ref. We'll look forward to being back with those guys again next week. Of course, good to be with you on podcast. Pretty much any podcast platform you can find our program. Thanks for being a part of our Own the East season preview week here, looking at some of the key position groups for UGA, how that could impact the upcoming season. And for now, we're operating on the assumption there will be a season. I'm optimistic there will be. Can't guarantee that because of the coronavirus, but let's have some fun. And let's just sort of appreciate this as the potential of being a season, the way that Georgia normally would have that. John Stinchcomb's been good enough to be a part of that with us here this week. We'll get more from John coming up in just a little bit here as well. His thoughts on the Georgia receiving group and how they really can make this year better than it was a year ago. Later on, we'll kind of expand beyond just owning the East to look at the rest of the SEC. We've done team previews on all the division opponents for Georgia in the SEC East. Today we'll look at two teams that Georgia plays in the SEC West, at least currently scheduled, Alabama and Auburn. We'll do that coming up a bit later on as our Own the East week continues here on DawgNation Daily. By the way, check out Before the Hedges presented by Kroger tonight here on this Wednesday. Jeff Sintel's got you with UGA Recruiting Talk. It's all brought to you by Kroger. And check out your local Kroger there as well. Getting your restock for back to school, enjoying what's left of the summer. Kroger's plenty capable of covering you for all that. So check out the Kroger closest to you for a lot more on that. Now, for Georgia to be the best that it can be at the wide receiver position, I think I was looking at the wrong camera, so I apologize for that. Let me look straight ahead here to you for a moment. For Georgia to be as good as it can be at the receiver position this year, it can't just be guys that we've already seen. It can't just be George Pickens. Pickens alone is not enough to totally transform this Georgia wide receiver group. I think there's room for guys who we haven't seen the best of, like a Demetrius Robertson or a Kearis Jackson, return to health, Dominic Blaylock. But in addition to that, you're also going to talk about a pretty impressive crop of 2020 signees that Georgia brought into the program. And I don't think you get the best of Georgia at the receiver position until some of that top-flight recruiting, Georgia receivers looking more from a recruiting standpoint, the way that other position groups have looked to be on this roster. You need some of those guys to play that way this year. Not always easy to do that. Pickens maybe made it last year at times look easier than it actually is. Other freshman receivers around college football may have done the same thing here in recent seasons, but plenty of opportunities for guys like Marcus Roseme and Justin Robinson and Jermaine Burton and Arian Smith. Plenty of chances for those guys, and Smart before has told us he likes what that group brings to the table. Here's what he said in the past.
Really excited about those guys. I mean, we've been excited about Justin for a long time. Marcus too. They both came to our camp over the summer and were competitive kids as you've seen out there in one-on-ones, and both of them had good senior years, and both of them won state championships. Arian's a kid who's got a lot of speed. It's pretty obvious that he can run fast. He wants to be able to run track here, which we've been very open to, and had success with Miko doing that. That was a big selling point for him.
One of the words that Smart uses there that I think is really good is the notion of competitiveness. That's the one thing about George Pickens that has come up on our show now a few times. Sean Bailey said this the other day. Kirby Smart echoed that when he spoke on an ESPN podcast, that there is just something about the love of football and the desire to compete that gives you a better chance of success. The fact that Smart says he's seen that from Burton and Robinson and Roseme and Arian Smith, and go ahead, Landon McConkey into that discussion. The fact that he's seen that from them, I think it's a really good thing. And I think that the best version of Georgia probably involves a couple of these freshmen having a really good season. Not always easy to do at the SEC level, but maybe necessary for this group this year to be as good as it can be. We'll have more on this with John Stinchcomb coming up in a moment. Later on, as I promised you, a little bit of a deeper preview of Alabama, Auburn, what both those teams bring to the table. It's a fun week for us. I'm enjoying vacation, but lucky enough to still speak to you anyway in pre-recorded fashion. It's our Own the East week here on DawgNation Daily. Let's do more with John Stinchcomb right now.
From Athens and across the SEC or wherever the recruiting trail may lead, here's a DawgNation.com insider.
Here on DawgNation Daily, it is time to continue our Own the East season preview. We've looked at quarterbacks, we've looked at running backs, and now we're looking at wide receivers, a position that John Stinchcomb, who's good enough to join us for this, has told us already that may rank amongst his biggest concerns of the upcoming season. John, you've said that in the past. Is that still kind of your feeling that, you're kind of, looking at what was not a strength for Georgia a year ago and wondering how different things going to be this year? I'm not putting words in your mouth when I say that, am I?
No, and it's got a lot to do with this offseason. I think there's such a lack of rhythm just because you haven't had time to create it with 7-on-7s and fast scales and those kind of things to see who's the guy that emerges and what skill set they bring to the table. I know you have a rough idea of who they are as players, but until you get them coordinated, I mean, I think that's the one question mark that sticks out most in my mind for this offense. And you know what you got in Pickens, but how Dom comes back from his knee injury, what these rookies bring to the table, how about some of these veterans that occasionally flashed or a guy like Tommy Bush who's coming back from an injury himself. So there's a number of question marks. What you got to like is the amount of talent that's there, but still there's such uncertainty as to how all these pieces fit, and which guys are really going to come to the top.
Yeah, because I think one of the things that's the most useless conversation possible is to talk about returning starters, so to speak, when it comes to receiver position, because of the fact that Georgia rotates so many, and after the first play of the game, you're running in a fresh crop of new receivers, that it's really more about returning production. And as measured by total touchdown scored, total yards scored, even with the big season from Pickens a year ago, and what you assume is, Dominic Blaylock coming back healthy this year as well, there's still not a lot of total production returning. Lawrence Cager was big for you a year ago. He's not coming back. Tyler Simmons kind of aged out of the program. He's not coming back anymore. So in terms of measuring your veteran experience, measurably, Georgia's still not off the charts at the receiver position, is it?
No, and, I think about a guy like Lawrence Cager last year who, a grad transfer comes in, and he, when healthy, he had a really strong year. But it took time to kind of figure out what the roles they were all going to play. And I think the offseason had a lot to do with that. And having such limited time and space with so many new faces, I think there's going to be a little bit more of a learning curve of how best to deploy that room specifically. I mean, there's like we said, there's good options. There's some uncertainty there, but how it all fits together is going to be a puzzle that you're really going to have to jam together pretty quickly.
In the time we have remaining on this topic, I want to deal with kind of two sides of the same coin. I think by now you and I have talked a ton about George Pickens. We expect Pickens to have a great season. I think the issue is who's the receiver that benefits most by the presence of Pickens, who really thrives because of the attention that Pickens is going to get. I think there are two categories here. There are guys who've played before, and there's some of the freshmen to the program. When I asked Terrence Edwards, your former teammate, about this, who was a great receiver, Georgia himself, and he talked a lot about Demetrius Robertson a couple of weeks ago on our program, or I should say last week on our program. When you look at that guy from the guys who've been here, who've been on the roster, who maybe look to blossom here this year, is it a Robertson for you? Who do you think benefits most by the presence of Pickens from the guys that we've actually seen play at UGA before?
Well, I think it's some of your interior receivers. I liked what Dom Blaylock did when given the opportunity, and Demetrius Robertson are the first two that really jump out at you as guys that were able to create space and find openings between the hashes, between the numbers. If Pickens was able to stretch the field and kind of get some of those, back shoulders and fades, and he had a number of plays interiorly as well. But I look for some of these slot receivers to get more space, because the safeties, I'm imagining, are going to start cheating towards Pickens, and that should really create some interior space. Which, if we're talking about the receiving game, I can't wait to see how these tight ends figure into the mix.
Yeah, that's a good point.
When you get McKitty coming in, I mean, that's a big old target in himself. Yeah. So, a lot to be excited about, but there's a lot of uncertainty as well.
I think
that's going to be.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. I think that's really well said. And then I guess last thing on this topic is, when you see a George Pickens have a great freshman season, and if there's no George Pickens, we're probably talking about a very good freshman season for Dominic Blaylock. I think sometimes we have a tendency to, you mentioned before on one of our earlier shows this week that running back may be a spot where as a freshman you can step in and kind of play right away. I think receivers sometimes, because we see some freshmen really do it, that we have a tendency to make it seem easier than it actually is. For guys like Marcus Rosemey, for guys like Jermaine Burton, Justin Robinson, Arian Smith, they're all going to have their chance, and the best version of Georgia probably requires some of those guys playing well. But this is still a pretty tough position to play as a freshman, is it not?
Yes, and a lot of it has to do with being able to block.
Yeah.
It's a little bit different in these college ranks of digging out safeties that recognize plays a lot quicker than what you've been used to in high school football. So if to stay on the field consistently, to get more reps, you have to be a factor in the run game, and that's a lesson that's hard learned for some of these rookie wide receivers, especially when there's not an established core of wide receivers at Georgia. I mean, outside of Pickens, you've got D-Rob and you got Don Blaylock, who both had their games where they really flashed. But for a young wide receiver, trying to understand not only how to create plays when the ball is headed your way, but that to stay on the field, you got to be proficient in the run game. I mean, that has been harped on since day one at Georgia, and I don't think that's changing anytime soon. So for some of these wide receivers that come in that just think that they can go out there and run good routes and catch the ball, college football is a little bit different than just being able to stretch the field, so to speak.
John Stinchcomb, great stuff. We'll look forward to talking some defense with you tomorrow.
Can't wait. Go Dogs.
Let's take a look around the rest of the league. This is SEC Through.
Good stuff from John Stinchcomb. And, John is so good to give us his time and be here and do this with us. I'm just grateful for it. I'm glad to be able to talk to him and glad to be able to talk to all of you as a part of DawgNation Daily here right now. And in our SEC Through, what we've been doing the last few days is kind of highlighting either a team from the SEC or a couple of teams in the SEC. I want to do a couple of those right now. I want to talk about Alabama. I want to talk about Auburn. Now, one of the things I said about Georgia going to Alabama in September earlier this week was that the potential mystery that Georgia has a quarterback could work to its advantage. The fact that Jamie Newman, JT Daniels, the two guys that I assume are the most likely starters for Georgia, the fact that they're different kinds of players, different kinds of skill sets. I think that potentially gives Alabama a lot to think about. It is fair to point out that Alabama could give Georgia something to think about, too. I don't know that Mac Jones and Bryce Young, the two potential starters at Alabama, are wildly different necessarily as players. Young maybe probably a little bit more athletic than Jones, maybe to a degree. But, ultimately, I think the thing for Alabama, just speak, from the perspective, if I was an Alabama fan, I don't think I would be excited about the fact that Jones and Young are necessarily quite so different as much as I would just be glad to know that I've got two potential options to find one quarterback capable of playing. Maybe Mac Jones is that guy. Played pretty well at the end of last year on the road at Auburn. Seemed to have a pretty good game, I guess. Gave Alabama a chance in some of those games after the Tua Tagovailoa injury. I think that Young is eventually the far better of the two prospects. I've said before, I believe that Georgia and Alabama will play twice this season, assuming it's somewhat of a normal season. I think you could see two different quarterbacks for Alabama in each of those games. I believe it'll be Mac Jones early. I believe it's more likely to be Bryce Young late. Young may play some in the game against September, but I think he'll at least be playing, assuming he's healthy, all the game come December when these teams play in the SEC championship. And I think one of the things when you think about either Mac Jones trying to become a full season starter for Alabama or Bryce Young trying to step in as a freshman quarterback, much the same way that Tua Tagovailoa was always helped by wide receivers. This has never gotten enough attention. Tua Tagovailoa is a good quarterback prospect. I don't think he's an all-time great college player. I don't think he's a game-changing player at the NFL level. I think he's good. I think the thing that helped him in Alabama, made him at times maybe look great, was the fact that he was playing with as good a collection of receivers as I've ever seen, maybe on one team at one time, certainly in a long time. Even better than the LSU crop of a year ago, what Alabama has enjoyed with the now-departed Henry Ruggs, Jerry Jeudy, go along with Devontae Smith and Jalen Waddle, guys who are still here. That's just a tremendous luxury for a quarterback to be able to enjoy. I think that Tua Tagovailoa used those guys well. Tua is certainly a special quarterback. Alabama had the success that he enjoyed would indicate that as so. But the eye-popping numbers he put up, I think receivers should get a lot of credit for that. And when you think about whether it be a Jones or a Young stepping in this year, half those receivers are gone, but Waddle is still there, Smith is still there. They will aid the transition for Alabama for sure. One of the questions I have about Alabama, though, think about the two great players that we think we know in this Alabama roster right now. Najee Harris at running back, and now healthy Dylan Moses at at linebacker. These are kind of the typical Alabama players. You expect good running backs. You expect good linebacker play. Alabama's had good linebackers for 40 years. But if you look at the last couple of years' worth of Alabama, wouldn't you say that the transition over to a Tua Tagovailoa-led team has seemed to come at the cost of maybe a little less physicality. Did you watch Alabama last season? Did you think they were as physical as they used to be? Still plenty good. Still a team that was a threat to make the college football playoff, even after losing to LSU. But were they physical a year ago? I mean, I would question that. When you're thinking about Alabama trying to beat Georgia in September in Tuscaloosa, trying to win the SEC West, I think it's only done in one of the last 3 seasons. Regaining some level of physicality, I think, is an important part of that discussion. And once that switch goes off, it is not as simple as flipping it back on again. Alabama finding that physicality is going to be a big part of the story in Tuscaloosa this season. Here's the other thing I'll say about Alabama, defensively. I think that Moses is pretty clearly a great linebacker. I think that Patrick Surtain Jr. is pretty clearly a great defensive back. I think to be a truly great defense, you have to have the great player at all 3 levels of the defense. Who is the great Alabama defensive lineman? I think we're still waiting to find that out. I think that Georgia's very much in the same discussion. You know that Georgia's likely to have a great defensive back because of the total number of players that you're considering there in those spots. But is there a truly great linebacker, a truly great defensive lineman? Georgia and Alabama dealing with some of the same stuff there. Let me also do a little bit on Auburn here for a moment. Bo Nix is coming back this season. What you may not quite be aware of, though, is as Nix tries to take the next step as a sophomore, Auburn is a little bit better, or has the potential to be a little bit better at the receiver position than you're used to Auburn being. It's been a while since we've talked about very good receivers at Auburn, but I think that Seth Williams is a very good player. I think that Anthony Schwartz is certainly a dangerous speed burner, the kind of player that Georgia's still seeking for its own roster. In terms of a better sophomore season for Bo Nix, Williams and Schwartz have a chance to allow that to happen. And then defensively, obviously we talk about a lot of what Auburn has lost. Great pass rushers, defensive linemen on the way to the NFL with Davidson and Derek Brown. I think it's important to still point out, though, what Auburn still has. I think that Big Cat Bryant is set up for a very good season, and I, fortunately, I say as someone who does want Auburn to do well, I think Auburn's pretty loaded at the linebacker spot. This is a pretty deep group right now with Popo, who you know about, KJ Britt. There's some linebackers here who can really play for the Tigers, and so Kevin Steele, who for whatever reason has just been a way better defensive coordinator at Auburn than he probably was in previous stops. I think he's really solidified what otherwise would have been a pretty chaotic situation at Auburn the last couple of years. They have big shoes to fill, big holes to replace on that defense. But when you look at the strength of linebacker, Popo, who's turned out to be a pretty good player, Big Cat Bryant, who I think is going to rank among the tops in the SEC, frankly, that's still a defensive team you have to really be aware of and pay close attention to. Georgia's slated to play them right now in October. And while that's a game I would pick Georgia to win, I would not pick it to be an easy win. And we'll make that your SEC through and wrap up here today on this Wednesday edition of our program, rolling through some vacation week shows, and glad to have you as a part of that. Still to come tomorrow, a little bit more on the Georgia defense. John Stinchcomb good enough to be a part of that with us tomorrow. Friday, it's Jeff Sintel talking some UGA recruiting. So we're having a good time here on the program right now. I'll also remind you, a great way to close things out today, Gator Hater Updater. Our buddy Eddie, who's never on vacation. Eddie's still doing his job. About 1,362 days. That's how long it's been since Florida's beaten Georgia. That is a great number to watch grow each and every day during the summer and even beyond Halloween when these two teams will play again in 2020. We expect that number to keep on climbing. Thanks for being here. Check out Before the Hedges, presented by Kroger tonight for UGA Recruiting Talk, and I'll see you back here tomorrow for another episode of DawgNation Daily. Hope all of you are enjoying your summer, whether you're on vacation this week or not. I'm certainly trying to enjoy mine. We'll talk to you tomorrow, everybody. And on video. Time now for our R.S. Andrews Cool Down. Appreciate you being here. And as I said before, I was saying this a minute ago, I think the Auburn defense this season, even in the kind of post-Derek Brown world, I think it's still a pretty good defense, I hate to say. Smoke Monday, some of those guys in the secondary. I think there's still some talent left there. And I don't know that, statistically speaking, may not be quite what it was a year ago, but this is still a pretty tough game for Georgia. It'll be interesting to see in that tug of war between Morris and Malzahn that Malzahn typically has with his offensive coordinators. What does that do to the Auburn running game? I think one of the things we have seen as of late is, maybe this is not quite the same Auburn rushing attack that it once was in the early days when the Gus Bus was so highly thought of. Does Tank Bigsby factor into that conversation more this season? That's going to be a pretty interesting thing to look at, not just in terms of, how Georgia performs one of its tougher games, but how much of a factor Auburn tries to be in an SEC West in which LSU's the reigning national champion. Alabama's almost everyone's pick to win it, and a lot of folks assume Texas A&M is going to be way better. How much does Auburn have a say in some of that kind of stuff? Could be pretty interesting. And don't forget about that currently scheduled non-conference matchup against North Carolina, which is also a very, very interesting early barometer for a lot of things related to college football. And, of course, by now, the Alabama game, we've kind of covered that way, one side down the other. You're pretty aware of the Alabama roster for right now. Thanks for being here, though, as a part of our R.S. Andrews Cool Down. Look forward to getting back to comments with you again next week. Hopefully you guys are commenting with each other here. And, of course, if your air conditioning goes out, R.S. Andrews can obviously replace that for you. But R.S. Andrews, I think, would also encourage you to make sure you service your air conditioning unit before it does go out. You can get your system tuned back up to factory fresh spec with our friends at R.S. Andrews. Story after story, they've been delivering smiles. This is one of the ways in which they do deliver those smiles, by getting in front of a problem before it becomes a bigger problem. So trust Dari and the whole team over there. I'm guessing we'll be hearing from Dari again here pretty soon as we get a little closer to the start of the season. But trust Dari and the whole team over there. Find them online at R.S. Andrews. They bring the R.S. Andrews Cool Down to us each and every day here on DawgNation Daily. I appreciate that. Also, make sure you check out AJC.com. As I am saying this, we are getting closer. Actually, as you're hearing this, as I'm saying this, we're still several days away. But as you're hearing this, we're getting a lot closer to the start of the Major League Baseball season. Braves getting going in the weekend against the New York Mets, and then playing a kind of a fun 60-game schedule. You can read all your Braves preview stuff online at AJC.com. I hope you'll check that out. So thanks for being here on DawgNation Daily here today. We'll do more extended versions of our cool down back when we're doing the show live again today. So we'll check all of that out. Thanks for being here. It's DawgNation Daily. We'll look forward to seeing you again tomorrow, everybody, 10 a.m. for the live to tape broadcast. You know what I'm saying. We'll talk to you then, everybody. For more DawgNation videos, check out youtube.com/DawgNation.